Ladies and gentlemen, this is the program on constitutional government, and our guest today is Peter Schuck. Peter Schuck is an emeritus professor at the Yale Law School and a sometime professor at the New York University Law School. Now, he's the author of a book, Targeting and Social Programs, Avoiding Bad Bets, Removing Bad Apples, and another book, Meditations of a Militant Moderate, Cool Views on Hot Topics. And he co-edited with James Q. Wilson a book which I recommend to all those interested in the general question of a book called Understanding America. And he's written now Why Government Fails So Often and How It Can Do Better. And he's going to talk on that subject. Let me mention that he was a graduate of Cornell and of Harvard Law School, and also of our very own Great Gray Green government department here at Harvard. So, Peter Schuck.
Thanks very much, Harvey, and I'm delighted to be here. The last time I spoke to this seminar, there were only about 15 people there, so it certainly prospered. I suspect there's a subsidy there somewhere. I don't know.
All these people are all well paid.
Okay. That's all the more in our system. That's all the more reason why they would be subsidized further. So I've been asked to speak for about 20 minutes, and I thought I would use that to sort of describe the contours of the book, but to mention some of the facts that led me to turn to this task, and it provides a context, I think, for understanding it. First, the limitations of the book. There are many limitations of the book. The two that I'll mention is that it concerns itself only with federal domestic policy, and so it has nothing to say about national security or military affairs. And secondly, it's not comparative. It's entirely focused on the United States. I suspect that some of the observations and analyses are transportable overseas, but I make no claims about that. And indeed, I emphasize, as I have in all my work, how exceptional the United States is in so many ways. So much of what characterizes our system for good and for ill is distinctive, if not unique, to the United States. So I begin with the observation that we are an extraordinarily successful society, and our government is a remarkably ineffective, unsuccessful polity. By that I mean that its policy products are, to a remarkable extent, ineffective, and I'll explain what I mean in a moment by ineffective. It has some signal successes, and I have a chapter on what those successes are, just as I could certainly recite, as all of us can, some of the failures of American society. But we have a distinctive relationship between society and the polity that I think helps to explain the ineffectiveness that one can't help but observe in the American political system. Another observation that frames my inquiry is the widespread perception among the American public that government is failing. And this perception is not by any means confined to Republicans who want less of it, and perhaps some of whom want it to fail, but also among Democrats who are the party of government and want it to succeed and in some cases expand. The trajectory of disaffection for government has increased or declined, as the case may be, at the very same time that the trajectory in government spending has grown. There's a remarkable parallel between them. Now, I do not make any strong causal claims, or really any weak causal claims about that, because both of those phenomena are overdetermined, and it would be very difficult to parse what causes what. But But it is striking that as government has expanded its activity level and its reach and its ambition and has penetrated farther into American life, the American public has found it wanting to an increasing degree. And then I asked the question, why is that? Why is the government failure perceived so not universally, but very significantly? And I entertain a few hypotheses which I mention but do not pursue because I think in part it's outside the ken of my expertise, but also because that's not the book I decided to write. One of which is that our society is an increasingly difficult society to govern. And I think that's true not only in the United States, but in all the Western democracies. And I have some theories about why that might be the case, but I don't spend any time trying to vindicate those theories. One claim would be that as we become more educated, and as the gap between our learning and that of our leaders has narrowed, we have less regard for their special claim on our respect. Secondly, I think it's obvious the case. It's a much more complex society, and so the interactions and interpenetrations of various elements of the society create problems that are both novel and extremely difficult to diagnose, much less remedy. So the tasks that government, especially an ambitious government, confronts today are great. There are also tasks that in some cases, not all, but in some cases are undertaken precisely because of the perception that the market has failed. So you would expect that there would be some proportion of government activity that undertakes harder problems than the market was able to solve. But on the other hand, there's much that government does that is relatively straightforward compared to what markets do. I'm sorry. Let me kill this. Oops. A former student looking for a job. So I don't think it's simply the case as some say that. Let me just turn it off. That it's simply because government's tasks are more difficult than the tasks of that are undertaken by civil society. So the hypothesis that I do investigate is that government is in disrepute because it doesn't perform well. And just as consumers expect value for their money, taxpayers expect value for their money. Now, it's also true, of course, that the product that government produces in many cases is much more complex and difficult to assess than the products that consumers spend their money on. That's often the case, not always the case. So I'm not placing complete faith in the perceptions of the public, but I think that's an important default explanation for why government is in disrepute, because people perceive that they're not getting what they bargained for. So I've undertake to determine what the reasons for this disaffection are on the assumption that it has something to do with government performance. And now, what do we know about government performance? Well, surprisingly little. And I'm just going to read a very telling quote from Peter Orszag, who was budget director under Obama, and John Bridgeland, who was a top budget official under George W. Bush. They say, based on our rough calculations, less than $1 out of every $100 of government spending is backed by even the most basic evidence that the money is being spent wisely. And in the healthcare area, which is, of course, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, they say, this is their quote, less than $1 out of every $1,000 that the government spends this year will go toward evaluating whether the other $999 plus dollars actually works. What I've attempted to do is to synthesize all of the work that's been done by social scientists, by government agencies like the GAO and CBO and departmental inspectors general, and by the think tanks like Brookings and AEI, and other scholars, to assess the effectiveness of government programs. And that leads me to, and so I believe that I have looked at and synthesized the vast majority, if not, I want to claim that it's all of the work, but obviously I've missed some, but it's a lot of it that has assessed government performance. Now, what do I mean by success and failure? The second chapter is an exploration of that, and basically the criterion of success that I use is cost effectiveness. Not because that's the only criterion. Indeed, I think it's a minimal criterion for denominating a program as being successful. It has to at least pass the cost effectiveness test. But also because I and a lot of very, very smart people have been struggling for decades to arrive at a better criterion of success and failure, and have not come up with one. And I believe that they won't. I think that ultimately this is a criterion to which there unfortunately is no rigorous alternative. Now, the rigor of cost-benefit analysis and its close cousin cost-effectiveness analysis is not altogether convincing in all cases, and the chapter does explore the limitations of those analyses and the ways in which scholars have struggled to refine it and to and come up with some alternatives. But again, if not this test, it's hard to know what other test exists other than the durability of a program, which is obviously not a valid measure of its success, and it's for its political support, which I think is one measure of success, but not a very satisfactory one. The next chapter describes the policy-making system. For those of you who've studied American government at Harvard or elsewhere and have taken administrative law, as Professor Fallon did when he was at Yale Law School, you wouldn't learn a lot from Chapter 3. But I hope there are some insights that begin to flow in Chapter 4, which is about the political culture of policymaking. My claim there is simply that there are deep structural features of our system that almost inevitably limit the effectiveness and the coherence and even the intellectual integrity or policy integrity of government policymaking. So I'll just mention the features of political culture. I'm happy to discuss any of them in detail in the Q&A if you wish. But I begin with constitutionalism, decentralization, protection of individual rights, interest group pluralism, acceptance of social and economic inequality, religion and political moralism, social diversity, populist suspicion of technical expertise and official discretion, public opinion, and civil society. And again, my argument is that these values, which are enormously important in our system, and which we almost all of which we should cherish, perhaps the only exception would be our acceptance of inequality, which is a complex question which we could talk about how we define inequality, how we measure it, how it changes, how much inequality is consistent with our other values, whether we're should be concerned more about inequality than we are with about low levels of consumption and poverty. But with that major exception, all of these features of our system are extraordinarily venerable and important to our democracy. And that makes the problem all the more difficult because we don't want to simply try to reduce the importance of these features. So they operate all the time at every level, pervasively, in undermining the policy coherence term I've used before, and by which I mean making the various elements of a policy consistent with one another, consistent with some overarching set of goals, and implemented in a rational and careful way. Then I discuss. I have 5 chapters in which I discuss what I call the 5 I's plus mismanagement. The 5 I's are incentives, irrationality, information, inflexibility, incredibility, and then I throw in mismanagement, which doesn't. I couldn't come up with an I word that would quite capture that. If anybody can. Incompetence. Yeah. Okay. Second edition. And again, I don't want to spend too much time discussing these unless you're interested. I would leave it to the Q&A to draw some of these out. But by incentives, incentives are particularly important and interesting because, in principle at least, they are remediable. That is to say, many of our policies have designed perverse incentives into them, and we could remove them in principle. It would be difficult politically, and it would have to be done carefully, but there's no reason, for example, why the perverse incentives that we've built into our insurance programs, particularly crop insurance, flood insurance, pension insurance, the kind of insurance that has infected and distorted the housing markets, why those perverse incentives have to be designed into them. Now, the problem of moral hazard, which is pervasive in our policy systems, and which is the main perverse incentive that I discuss here, is not the main. It creates a special problem when we want to target programs at low-income people, because if we simply made them share more of the costs of the activity, that would defeat the purpose of increasing their income. Yet it's important for them to have a stake in the programs that are designed for their benefit. And so there's a special problem with trying to avoid moral hazard in programs targeted at low-income people. Basically, what we have to do is use work incentives to do that, and that's what we've done. But it's often very ineffective, in part because the nature of our economy, in part because job training programs are a species of public policy that have been dismal failures, with very few exceptions. And I have some evidence in the book on that. So that's a brief introduction to the question of incentives. I'll mention one of the other I's just because it's probably less familiar to you, and that's what I call incredibility. By that I mean that if the government is going to mount an effective policy and implement it well, it has to enlist other actors. They may be state and local actors. They may be other federal actors. They will almost certainly be market actors. And in order to do that, the government has to underwrite the stability and the predictability of the policies that it's adopting. You can't expect people in a market situation. It's very obvious that if you can't guarantee people some predictable outcome, then you're going to have to pay a lot more for to defray for them the cost of uncertainty. And the government programs create enormous uncertainty that there's not much the government can do about. And why is that? Because we're a democratically accountable regime, and the government policy that is adopted in 2014 may not, indeed, with some strong probability, will not be in place in 2020. So the example I use, the current example I use to explain this is Medicaid, the expansion of Medicaid and Obamacare, which is one of the main features of that policy initiative. Under Obamacare, 100% of the expanded cost of Medicaid will be defrayed by the federal government for 3 years. And then after that, I believe it's 90% of the additional cost. So you say, well, that's free money. Why wouldn't states adopt that? The answer is, there are several answers. One of it is that, there are Republican states that resist the expansion of Medicaid for a variety of reasons. But even some Democratic controlled states have resisted. And the reason is that they don't have any confidence that the government is going to make good on its promise. And there's no way that it can hold the government to its promises. And the government has violated previous promises when it changes its policy. Now, when the market confronts, as it does routinely, the problem of uncertainty in the future, there are a variety of market mechanisms that can be used to allocate the cost of that uncertainty and unpredictability in ways that will enable transactions to proceed even in light of uncertainty. But what's striking is that the government doesn't have those tools available to it. It can't bond itself. It can't pay additional costs in order to insure people against future changes to nearly the same extent that market actors can. So after reviewing the Five Eyes and mismanagement, I have a couple of chapters that I ought to mention, and then I'll stop. One is about markets. And it seems to me that markets also present an extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, problem for government to solve in the following sense. The markets are extraordinarily powerful in our society, and by and large, that's a very, very good thing. It protects not only our economic interests, but it also protects our liberties in important ways. However, markets are systematically undermine the coherence, the policy integrity of government programs. Why is that? Because markets possess a number of characteristics that government does not possess, or the same characteristics in much greater measure. So markets are a lot more nimble. They're much better informed. Indeed, the rapidity with which information is gained and the accuracy of that information is itself a valuable asset which the market rewards. And so it acts on the basis of much better information. It's much faster. It's smarter in many obvious respects than government can be. And that's not a comment on the intelligence of the people who acted. It's a comment on the dynamics that drive both each of those systems. Then I have a chapter. So I explain in a variety of different ways, a variety of different characteristics of markets that undermine policy effectiveness. Another one would be that markets do not respect jurisdictional lines, whereas government must respect jurisdictional lines. So that necessarily creates black markets, either domestically or internationally, which undermines the coherence and integrity of the government programs. And there are a variety of other characteristics. Another has to do with price and substitution effects, that when government regulates a particular activity, the responsive providers of that activity or service need to increase the price to reflect the costs imposed by those regulations. That's going to lead to certain substitutions on the part of demanded by consumers or provided by suppliers. And so the government's going to end up with a very different set of market dynamics than it started with. And there are any number of examples of that. And then I have a chapter called The Limits of Law, by which I mean the inherent limits of law, by which I mean those features of legal regimes that that are inescapable anytime you use law to perform governmental functions, and that means virtually all policies. I've tried to think of policies that do not involve law, and the only one I can think of is jawboning, which, when presidents were more powerful, was a more effective policy than it is now, for good and for ill. So I explore a variety of features of law that will, again, many of them are features that we revere. Due process, for example. We revere that properly because we revere rule of law values, and due process improves the kinds of information that are provided. By and large, it protects dignity. It constrains officials exercising discretion. A lot of other extremely important rule of law values. But on the other side, it's very costly. It lends itself to opportunism and delay by those who are subject to it. It becomes a tactic in the intricate bargaining games that go on between market actors and government, and among government officials, and so forth. So those are just a couple of the aspects of legal institutions that I mentioned. And then I have a chapter on the bureaucracy, and this is a very sad story. The decline of the federal bureaucracy, for a variety of reasons, is extremely dangerous, I think, for our system, since big government is not going away, in my view, and we need talented, highly motivated people to administer that. We could certainly change some of what they do, and we can try to recruit better, smarter, and more dedicated public servants. But that's highly constrained by a variety of factors, including Congress's insistence on maintaining control over compensation levels, so that federal bureaucrats today are vastly underpaid at the high levels, and vastly overpaid if you include benefit package, which are much richer for them than almost any American workers today, perhaps even including Harvard professors, though I'm not sure about that. But that's the fault. So much of what I'm describing can be laid at the door of Congress, and that's a particularly vivid example, because Congress refuses to arrange for compensation for government officials that exceeds their own compensation, regardless of whether that compensation is necessary to attract the talent that's necessary. And then two other chapters, quickly. The first is about government successes, policy successes, and I discuss about a dozen of those. If you're interested, I'll describe those. But one is the Earned Income Tax Credit that Roger Porter had a hand in devising. Another is the GI Bill, the Voting Rights Act, 1965, the Immigration Act, 1965, the Homestead Act, the NIH, the Morrill Act, which established the land-grant college system, and a variety of others. And then the last chapter I'll mention, last chapter in the book, except for the conclusion, is remedies. And what I want to say about remedies, and what I do say about remedies, is, first of all, they will strike some readers as small-bore remedies. This is partly because I'm an incrementalist by conviction and by training, and part of that is because in a society that's as complex as ours, and a polity that's it's manifestly more complicated than any other political system in the world, even though our government occupies less prominent proportion of the GDP than in some other countries. There's simply no way of predicting in a responsible way what's going to happen if we move, for example, from a presidential system to a parliamentary system, or even less grandly, if we adopted a line item veto for the president, which exists in most states for governors, but not at the federal level. I don't think we have a very good idea of how doing that would change the intricate relationships among actors at the federal level. Let me give you one quick example, and then I'll stop. Good government forces succeeded in 2010, I think, in eliminating earmarks. Earmarks being basically the product of log rolling on the part of legislators to identify particular projects that will receive appropriated funds, and they were generally believed to be a kind of corruption and certainly a source of great inefficiency in the government. The bridge to nowhere that Ted Stevens sponsored. The political scientists whom I've read on this have concluded that the elimination of earmarks is part of, and a not insignificant part of, the gridlock that we see in Washington. It transformed the nature of the bargaining that goes on and the relationships among policymakers. And so even something that one might think as simple and as straightforward as that had severe, unpredictable effects that were very, very consequential. So why don't I stop there and see what you're interested in talking about?
Well, thanks very much. And Tom Palmer? Sorry.
Correctly, among those positive principles, there was inequality, and that seems more like a result, maybe an inevitable result. And I wondered why that was an equal opportunity.
Well, I think our acceptance of inequality, which is, and again, these are very complicated concepts to define and to measure, and certainly to reshape. I think many of our policies fail because we target them very poorly in ways that tend not to focus resources on those who need them most. It's very true of our tax system. It's true of our polity generally. That is to say, we spend on the elderly a vastly disproportionate amount of the government resources that we allocate to groups than compared to children, and so we seem to, for a variety of complex reasons, and some of which have their good sides, we don't demand as much in the way of rectification of inequality at the low end as many other societies do. Now, we do it in different ways, so that I was just saying this the other night at Harvey Mansfield's, that our welfare state is considerably larger than it's often described, because a lot of it is done through the tax system, the system of tax expenditures. But those tax expenditures are very perverse distributionally. The health care, the tax deduction for health insurance expenditures is very, very regressive. And of course, the deduction for interest on home mortgages is very regressive. And those are very large items, but they don't appear on the federal budget because they're tax expenditures. So there is, for complicated reasons, an acceptance of inequality in our society, and I have some theories about why that might be. I'll just say one very briefly. That complicates our policymaking and contributes to, I think, to its poor targeting and effectiveness. One reason why the targeting is very poor is for the obvious political interest group bargaining dynamics in which well-organized, narrowly defined and well-organized concentrated interests have a disproportionate influence. A part of it is that we are less interested in inequality than we are in absolute levels of consumption. We think that poor people are better off in the United States than in almost any other country, notwithstanding the fact that from an inequality point of view, they're worse off. And we believe that what's important is that they have relatively high levels of consumption, rather than how the Gini coefficient assesses any particular policy. There are doubtless other explanations.
Yes, Rory.
So I noticed that, if I'm not mistaken, the federal debt surpassed 100% of GDP last week. And the debt didn't appear, I don't believe in any of the remarks you made, but it just seems that it's an issue and that the growth, when you read a book called Why Government Fails, it seems why government fails so often. It seems in part it would fail so often because it's so big and trying so hard on so many fronts all the time. Every year it's growing. And it seems to be in part growing because of the debt. It's allowed to grow because the debt is growing.
Well, it seems to me that's epiphenomenal. That is to say, it's growing. It's growing. The fact that it's growing isn't necessarily a bad thing if we're effective and if what it was doing was wise. So it reflects rather than causes, I think, the problems that I do describe in the book.
Because one question I just wanted to try to be interested in your response would be that from a certain point of view, government might not be failing. That is from its own point of view. I don't know exactly who that is. That wouldn't be the administrations per se, the president or the Congress, but the general bureaucracy, Washington, D.C., the government in its broader sense, because it continues to grow its power and its influence through bureaucracy, through these kinds of instruments it has at the federal level, it aggrandizes itself as much as it might fail on a policy analysis basis, or as much as the public may be increasingly dissatisfied with government. The government, because it grows.
Well, when you see a pathological condition over a long period of time and increasing in its perverseness, which I think is a fair, though perhaps a bit exaggerated view of our situation here, you know, as night follows day, that very powerful interests have a stake in that, in maintaining the status quo and in fact engrossing themselves. So it's no great mystery, it seems to me, why the trajectories tend to increase, because they have a stake. The powers that be, the people who make the decisions, have a stake in growing this. And just one set of actors, but an extremely important one, not so much at the federal level as at the state and local level, are government unions, which have a very great stake in expanding government employment and government expenditures. And in a city like New York, where we see the way in which that plays out in terms of transit and education, sanitation, and all these other services, which the government unions constantly increase pressure to, and because they tend to vote and lots of other people don't vote, and they have a disproportionate amount of influence, especially on de Blasio in New York, because they were his main source of support. That creates a very strong dynamic propelling the expansion of government. Now again, in principle, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If we got greater value out of what government does, many people would prefer that, but we don't. And I'm trying to explain why it is that we don't.
Yes.
I know you'd like to be moderate, as most people do, but I think intellectuals actually almost have a duty to be extreme and stake out turf. So doesn't this suggest one reform, outlaw labor unions, which wouldn't matter much for the private sector because they've lost a lot of their power by market forces, but it have a huge impact on the public sector?
Well, that's a fair question. In the private sector, as you know, as I suppose you know, the labor unions now constitute or control only about 7% of the workforce, and you contribute that to market forces. I think that's largely true, but it also involves a very aggressive anti-union tactics on the part of employers within the law, most of it within the law. Should they be abolished? I haven't studied that enough to know. I favor the right of people to organize and to protect their interests. I understand the fact that unions are particularly prone, as we learned way back in Michael's, I forget the title of the book, famous book on the iron law of oligarchy, that unions are especially prone to corruption and to leadership maintaining their position over a long period of time. Union democracy is a kind of oxymoron in the vast majority of unions. But when they should be, it's not clear to me that they should be abolished. It seems to me that's a basic right that workers ought to have, so long as they don't impose their costs improperly on others.
Little follow-up, antitrust law? That is, should companies have the same right to organize, to go on strike, to keep their prices up as a basic right?
Well, you mean
Well, that is, we have antitrust law, we exempt labor unions, and they used to be covered before 1914. I don't mean monopolize.
Yeah, it's a fair question. You know, it seems to me there is a difference, but I haven't studied enough to give a good answer.
Sure. Peter, you described yourself as an incrementalist, and yesterday you were talking about Wildowski and Lindblom and the wisdom of incrementalism. Led me to wonder why incrementalism, which is really one of the primary features of American political system, works so poorly now, and why that might not be such a virtue of the system. And I came up with a couple of possibilities. One is that incrementalism requires you to have some knowledge of the consequences of what you're doing before you take the next step. And now public policy making is so abstract. We make incremental changes, one on top of the other, before we know what's going to happen. Another is that that it requires a forum for bargaining, like as Wildowski would. And we have now these multiple forums that are unconnected. And just lay out a third possibility, which is...
What do you mean by that? Multiple forms that are unconnected?
Yeah, so that, I mean, what do we think, how did we used to make the budget? I mean, those of you not familiar with Wildowski, he has this amazing book where he says you have this very decentralized system, and it creates a balanced budget. It's really quite remarkable. But as he pointed out in his later books, that now we have entitlements that are not controlled by the appropriations process. Now we have lots of budget spending, so that...
And we don't have a budget process.
Right.
We haven't had a budget in, what, 8 years?
Yeah, so you don't have a budget process at all. You don't really have a budget at all anymore, which shows kind of the disintegration of the institutions that he was so good at describing. And just, and it's struck me, another one is, to use Hugh Hecklow's term, policy congestion. You know, that when you have incremental changes in all these areas, that coordination becomes, and coherence becomes so much more important. I'd just add one other, which is that that with divided government and gridlock, you've got this incredible incentive for when you get control to make this big move, like with Obamacare, and then you can't adjust it later on. I mean, as you know, with Medicare and Medicaid, we made lots of adjustments in future years and through legislation. We can't do that now. So I just wondered if you could say, to what extent have these changes in the political system made the incrementalism that we both value work less well?
Well, I think I think your observation is correct. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the remedy for it is. That's why I'm a little embarrassed, but I think philosophically committed to the notion that responsible reformers ought to be incremental. Not because I don't think that our system could use a jolt and to alter these familiar and in many cases corrosive patterns, but because I really don't know what would make matters better. Now, I do have a whole chapter on remedies, but as I say, they're modest remedies, and they're remedies that, and I'll get back to your question, they're remedies that are across-the-board remedies. They're cross-cutting remedies. They're remedies, I believe, that would apply to ought to apply to virtually every program, because I think in order to analyze, for example, how the tax system ought to be changed, I'd have to be a tax lawyer, and I would have had to write a very, very different kind of book that I'm not competent to write. So, figuring out the remedies for this incrementally sluggish policy environment is very difficult. Now, I'm not sure your description is entirely accurate. That is, we have had some major non-incremental changes, and we in the last 15 years, for example. But some of them have been reversed, and I'm not sure whether that confirms or refutes my observations. But we eliminated farm subsidies about 20 years ago, and then they were restored. We have a very different system of taxation. Resulted now it's been 30 years than previously existed. Again, that those reforms have eroded, and we're faced with another round. Social Security was fundamentally changed in 1983. Again, 30 years later, we need to do it again. And Obamacare is, I think, it depends how one defines these things, of course, but I would consider that a very significant change. Maybe it's merely incremental because it is built on top of basically the same system that created the vast inefficiencies and ineffectiveness in the past. That's one of the reasons why I think Medicare I count as not as a policy success because it impounds and magnifies all of the defects in the existing fee-for-service system. So I don't know. I think we do have some instances of major change, but they tend, as the examples I gave suggest, to be eroded over time. There does seem to be a kind of equilibrium to which we return, and we have to disturb it from time to time. But there is this the inertia of the status quo tends to reassert itself.
Yes.
Sir, I am impressed by your talk. You've persuaded me. I certainly must read your book. But yes. I have a problem with the overall arching thesis as you present it, in that it seems to me to be ineffable. There are no comparisons. And here I'd like to make a suggestion.
You mean international comparisons?
Well, that and intranational comparisons. It seems to me that perhaps there's a project for your unemployed student here, but I would like you to compare the cost effectiveness, on the cost effectiveness spectrum, America with any other country you choose. I'll pick Finland out of the hat to make it easier and to see how bad we are or not. And I think otherwise I find it difficult to judge our performance, since that's what you're talking about, unless I can do a fair comparison with someone else. Within the nation, from the list of things you mentioned, it seems to me that there's another book, you've already touched on it, with regard to Obamacare, fossilizing difficulties from the private care insurance system. But I would like to have you do the same cost-benefit analysis, comparing Obamacare with the private system, perhaps a little bit before Obamacare and now during it, to judge it, because the complaints about the private care are extensive. And then one other one popped up to me from the list you gave, and that is vocational training. Once upon a time, corporations were very diligent, or big ones, in training their workers. Mitt Romney's daddy was trained by GM University in-house to be an automotive engineer. The training within the job, ongoing training in the large corporations was quite extensive. They have dropped that. And so we are left with a impoverished public education to try to do vocational training, though there have been public-private training, as in South Carolina, that have worked out very well in northwestern part of South Carolina. So that would be another comparison in terms of what pays off. And I think that would remove some of the quality of inevitability. Nonetheless, I want to conclude by saying, I want to believe what you say. I'd like to, but I'd like to see more comparative
Well, it's a pretty
evidence.
grim story. I'm not sure why you want to believe it.
Well, believe it's truth.
But let me respond to, and if I missed some of these points, you raised 3 points, I think. The first was comparative. I think I wish I were competent to, or had a long enough lifespan to do the comparative analysis that you referred to. But let me say this much. We compare very favorably in many dimensions. Education is the one where in recent years we seem to have fallen especially short. Infant mortality rates have improved quite dramatically in the United States. They're still above some other countries, but this is an interesting point. We calculate our infant mortality figures differently than most other countries, and we include aborted pregnancies as infant mortalities after a certain period of time. And I don't know the details, but I know that is there's a counting problem there. But even if that were not the case, I think we know that a great deal of our infant mortality performance is hobbled by low-income communities, and that seems to be that is a problem that is much worse in the United States than most of our counterpart nations. Partly because we have a history of slavery that they don't have. Partly because we have, in some ways, made it more difficult for. There's an interesting book that's been written called "Please," something like "Please Stop Helping Me." It's about how many of our poverty programs have made matters worse for poor people. But I don't pretend to have any solution to the poverty problem. I'm talking about impacted poverty. I'm not talking about Harvard students while they're matriculating. I have some thoughts, but okay. So enough on that. So in terms of countries like Finland that have a better performance on certain international metrics with regard to education, we do have a much higher college matriculation rate than I think any other country, even today. We're educating a lot of people who probably can't succeed at college. We think that that's a good thing. We think that that's equal opportunity. But the fact is that many people who are attending college today and amassing huge debts are probably not equipped to complete a college program that we would consider valuable. They would probably be better off with a certain type of training. Which leads me to your second question, not having adequately answered the first. And that has to do with job training. I don't think you're right. I think corporations today do a good deal of on-the-job training, in part because of their perception that the education system is failing them. I don't have data that could indicate what the comparisons are to past periods, but I'd be surprised if there wasn't a lot of it going on today, and I know that there is certainly some. Let's see, well, you had a third.
Health comparison of private and public health insurance.
Well, I am not condemning Obamacare out of hand. I think it has achieved some benefits that the previous system wasn't. And I'm not copping out by saying we don't really know yet what the consequences of the new system are going to be. I think there are some danger signals, many of which were predicted by critics. But I think, as Shep mentioned earlier, some of these may be changed. We're not finished with Obamacare. Certainly, the Republicans aren't finished with Obamacare. It's an extraordinarily complex. The healthcare system is an extraordinarily complex system. The vast majority of Americans are satisfied with the healthcare system. This is sort of like a couple of other sort of analogous things. One is the vast majority of Americans are very satisfied with their jobs. I think it's something like 85% are satisfied with their jobs. It's a surprise. That's a big surprise. The vast majority of Americans are happy. What do they mean by happy? What do I mean by happy? I don't really know. But these are standard. This is standard survey evidence. The vast majority of Americans are pleased with. This used to be the case. I don't know if it's probably not as true as it was. That with their congressperson, even though they're disgusted with Congress. So there are what might seem like anomalies in these observations, and they would complicate the comparison. But the pre-Obamacare health system was, except for those who were uninsured, about 15%. Some of those people were uninsured by choice because they're young people who didn't want to pay the cost of what seemed like an uncertain benefit. But many of them were not covered by choice, were not uninsured by choice, and were not covered by Medicaid for one reason or another. There has been that's an important shift, and those are significant benefits. How that will work out as the insurance exchanges operate with premium increases and shifts in who is offering, which insurers are offering plans and other variables, it's really hard to say.
Mark.
Yeah, I want to see if I can shake you a little bit out of your incrementalism, which you and Chip think is so wonderful, by quoting your the co-author of your magnificent volume on Understanding America. James Q. Wilson argued that really at the root of a lot of problems that you're stating was a big idea, the idea of the decline of what he called the legitimacy barrier. That a country founded on the principle of limited government had essentially abandoned the idea in favor of an idea that if something bad was happening in the society, it was the government's responsibility to do something about it. That's a sea change in the understanding of American government. And Wilson argued, and of course I'm attaching myself to Wilson because he's a good person to attach to, argued that that might, in other regimes, maybe they could handle that, but that our regime essentially couldn't handle that. And that all the I's that you point out, and the M, which the fifth I, which he adds, it's endemic in a way to the over-ambitiousness of the central government. It can't do it. And so why not?
Can I just interrupt you for a moment to read a passage from Wilson that captures this very nicely? This is by Wilson and John DiIulio. It said, the old system had a small agenda. When someone proposed adding a new issue to the public agenda, a major debate often arose over whether it was legitimate for the federal government to take action at all in the matter. For the government to take bold action under this system, the nation usually had to be facing a crisis. Each succeeding crisis left the government bureaucracy somewhat larger than it had been before, but when the crisis ended, the exercise of extraordinary powers ended. The new system, in contrast, is characterized by a large policy agenda, the end of the debate over the legitimacy of government action, to your point, except in the area of First Amendment freedoms, the diffusion and decentralization of power in Congress, and the multiplication of interest groups. Under the old system, the checks and balances made it difficult for the government to start a new program, underscored, and so the government remained relatively small. Under the new system, these checks and balances make it hard to change again italicized, what the government is already doing, and so the government remains large.
Right, and so Wilson isn't arguing that the government should never take on a new task. He's just arguing that the presumption should be so strongly in the other
The default has
direction.
changed.
So that's not, it wouldn't be incremental, it seems to me, to restore some notion of the default. What do you think about that?
I think that genie may be out of the bottle. I don't know. I don't know how to restore the old system. I don't think many Americans would be in favor of it if it came down to their Medicare program, their Social Security program, their Obama, their health care benefits, their student loans, their food stamps, their child welfare credits. I don't know. I'm skeptical of that.
It strikes me that, working on this same point, that your book does not say much about partisanship. There's one of our parties, say the Progressive Party, which understands progress as equalizing, and equalizing through bringing greater benefits to those presently unequal. And they've, over the years, since this progressivism was first defined, have continued to find new ways of equalizing, and their whole party consists in that. Without progress, i.e. larger government, they have nothing to say. So isn't that a factor? Why aren't you a Republican?
Because so many of the
You need to get closer to the mic.
because so many of them are outrageous. But that's also true on the extreme left. Yeah, I don't talk a lot about partisanship for precisely the reason that this book was written, which is to try to identify the deeper structural institutional factors that seem to exist and operate regardless of which party is in power. I certainly take your point, and I think Jim Wilson was discussing that in part when he referred to the shift from the old system to the new system. That is not just the rise of a progressive Democratic Party particularly after the Civil Rights Movement, but the gradual adoption by the public at large, as it's become more highly educated, of more egalitarian values. Now, there's a limit in the United States, given our political culture. There's a severe limit on the extent to which those values will be adopted, and for which the public is willing to pay to achieve equality, which is, depending on how you think about equality, it can't be done. There will never be enough money, never be enough government power to equalize all the things that people want to equalize. But putting that aside, that progressive spirit, at least, seems to me have triumphed in the political culture. And of course, it's constrained in lots of ways, and we'll see precisely when the Republicans take over Congress. We'll see what the equilibrium is between them. But that's certainly part of the story. And I didn't emphasize it precisely because I wanted to emphasize dynamics that exist independent of the parties, that are hardwired, in a sense, into our system.
Susan Chow.
So So I'd like to push back against this limited government idea because, well, I've been reading Hobbes this term, and I guess it's infected me. It seems to me we may have limited government, but we don't have limited sovereignty, or we have our sovereignty is a complicated question. The Constitution starts, we the people, and the we is somehow a collective we that's in some sense the source of sovereign authority. That just taking a beat from Hobbes, there's certain things that a sovereign has to do, and when he fails to do, or she fails, when those things don't happen, you don't have a country anymore. So it's not just a matter, I want to suggest, that of fairness or an ideology of progress. It's that a limited government ideal, if it's ineffective, if it can't preserve law and order, if it can't provide for the common defense, if it can't do a number of other things, at some point you don't have a state. And that's just the reality, I mean, from an Hobbesian point of view. It's not just that, we want to be fair and nice. It's that the question is limited government in the 18th century sense, where everything is sort of left to little localities and small business, can that work now? And so it seems to me that's the question you raise, of how do you get done the kinds of things, not that Republicans like or Democrats like, but how do you get done the things that, if we don't get them done, we won't have a country anymore in the longer run.
Well,
and so from that perspective, I just wonder if you could.
I don't think we're anywhere close to or approaching
Collapse.
that situation. No, I reject that categorically. I think, but let me give you an example of if Jim Wilson were alive today, I'm sure he would see us as a manifestation of the new system. The problem, and here I'm wading into very, very controversial, dangerous waters, but take sexual assaults on campus. Now, nobody knows how to solve the problem of sexual assaults on campus because, in part, they're due to the extraordinary ambiguity of relations between young men and women. They have a lot to do with alcohol. They have a lot to do with people being liberated from the confinement of their parents' regime. It's a really hard problem. Now we have the Office of Education, the Office of Civil Rights, whose director is a former student of mine and a great person, but she is determined to assert federal power to solve this problem. Not simply to illuminate the problem, not simply to identify best practices and so forth, but to regulate the hell out of this problem. I think this is absolutely wrong. I think to the extent that solutions are going to arise to this problem, they're going to arise on individual campuses with individual students in interaction with their parents. And I don't think the Office of Education in Washington has anything to offer in the solution of this problem. It can require, as it has already required some years ago, that campuses report crime. And there are some modest things that it can do. But in terms of wielding carrots and sticks to solve this problem on the campuses, it has absolutely no prospect of success. And what's going to happen is that after it tries to wield these carrots and sticks, mostly sticks, it's going to fail. The rates are not going to be much affected, or if they are affected, it's not going to have much to do with these regulations from the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education. And the government will again be blamed for being ineffective by people like me. But at least I think I can understand the reasons for that failure. And so we'll have the same problem, but the government's legitimacy in addressing it will be impugned, and indeed the government will be accused of callousness and indifference to women and violence and all of that. So what is the federal government doing trying to regulate in this area? And it will. I mean, the Congress is gearing up to do that.
No, I agree with you.
Right, I'd like to bring the discussion back to the egalitarian, the equality. I I don't think that and in the process, I think present a little more optimistic view than you have in terms of what I think government has accomplished. But I don't think that a lot of these policies that have been suggested have been pushing towards egalitarianism, and that which would be a pipe dream. I know when I first started, maybe 25 years ago, watching the Forbes 400 list, you could get in on that list at $100 million. Well, today we have some hedge fund, private equity guys making a few $1 billion in a particular year. So there's no way that government's going to, other than confiscation, is going to come anywhere close to providing egalitarianism. But what I do think that the government has done through a variety of the programs which you have mentioned is I think it has pushed the people at the bottom, ordinary people, up. And similarly, I think labor unions did the same thing. I grew up in a labor union town, and people were basically uneducated, but they made a decent living. Unfortunately, those jobs have, to a large extent, disappeared. But you look at Obamacare, it has provided...
You recognize there's a connection between those two phenomena.
Well, actually it did. This was, it was in western Montana, and it was the Anaconda Company, it was copper. And basically, the company didn't innovate. I worked for 2 summers on that, and some of the technology that I worked with was 16th century technology. So obviously they went out of business, but that's a sideline. But in terms of these various policies, Obamacare has provided the ability for many to get insurance. It has actually also provided another benefit, which people are just beginning to acknowledge, which is good for the capitalist system, is that since healthcare is not tied to employment, people can quit their jobs and look for another job and have insurance. And I've seen many business leaders applaud this particular. Food stamps, same thing. Medicare, obviously there are some problems with these in terms of implementation, but for people reaching the age of 65 or more to have that health care, that provides, I think, a tremendous benefit. So I see, actually, despite all of the implementation problems, that the government, the bigger government, not the limited government, has provided a tremendous resource in pushing people up a little bit, not trying to make them equal to others.
Well, I agree with the general observation that when the government spends, its budget now is $19 trillion or whatever it is, there's going to be some benefits. Some people are going to be advantaged by that. So there's no question that that's occurred. The question really is whether we can spend that money more effectively, given the same goals than we now do. And I have no doubt that that's possible. So to cite the gains that have been enjoyed in the period of time during which the government has also been expanding, and I put it that way because it doesn't necessarily mean that the government's expansion is responsible for these changes. I think the market factors dwarf almost anything that the government can do in this area. To recognize that people, including poor people, are better off than they were 50 years ago is, I think, accurate. But I don't think it refutes the point that a lot of this money is wasted, and a lot of the programs actually make poor people worse off. And it's a complicated analysis. I think I'll stop there.
Jim Hankins.
Of course, it also ignores opportunity cost of not having a very expensive government and how much people could do with their own money if they were allowed to do that. But that's another issue. What I wanted to ask you about was the issue of, getting back to the point of your book, which is about how to make government better. And it seems to me one thing you could do is not change the goalpost all the time. I read an article in Mercatus Center website by Véronique de Rougy, who said that if we measured poverty by the standards...
I wish I had a name like that.
Yeah, she's
Might sell more.
She's a libertarian economist in France. Anyway, she said that if we measured poverty by the standards of what poverty was in 1960, that there wouldn't be any people who are poor. Right? And that we've kept redefining poverty higher and higher and higher, so the people who are poor in our country are middle class in most other countries. I heard on the radio just a couple of days ago, a government agency was broadcasting that there are 45 million people going to bed hungry tonight in America. And I said, that can't be right. So I went to the NPR website, I found the footnotes, and then I read the article, and it turned out that the 45 million people had answered yes to one of the two following questions. The first question was, have you at any time in the past year been hungry? And I answered yes to that. Hunger, that you didn't have enough money, you didn't have enough money to buy time yet, any time in the last year. The second time was, have you ever felt that you might not be able to feed yourself with your own resources any time in the last year? So that was the 45 million people who went to bed hungry in America. I mean, that seems to be a problem of government lying. Basically, that's a lie, to tell people that. And secondly, moving the goalposts all the time. And it strikes me that there are a lot of people, I'm afraid they're mostly in the Democratic Party, who don't want poverty to go away. They want to have that vote. They want to be able to twist people's emotions and say, and to call Republicans bad names and say they don't care about the poor. I think if we are a little more honest and we were a little more careful about how we talked about these things, that the government wouldn't be called upon to do so many things.
Well, I think there's a lot in what you say. I do disagree with the notion that moving the goalposts is necessarily a bad thing. In a society as wealthy as ours, much wealthier than it was 50 years ago, it seems to me arguable, at least, that we ought to share that wealth in ways that were not possible in a poorer society. Now, how we do that, of course, that's the $64 trillion question. But I don't see anything inherently illogical, much less immoral, about holding the society up to higher standards as its resources have increased.
Just to make a comment on that, there's a moral philosopher at Princeton who is a member of your party, I'm quite sure, named Harry Frankfurt, who wrote a very interesting article about this. And he thinks that there's a huge moral difference, he's a moral philosopher, between the demand that we should be equal and the demand that everyone should have enough. And you can defend the position that everyone should have enough, and I would certainly defend that. But whether everyone should be equal or that no one should be in the bottom 10% of American income, that seems to me a different issue.
Well, there's a lot of foolish talk about equality, and people do not think as clearly as they ought to about these sorts of things. They don't define terms rigorously, and the distinction between having enough and being equal is a fundamental distinction. And I think most of the talk about it sort of begs that question. So I don't know. I wouldn't take people to task for not being members of a seminar like this and not speaking as precisely as they ought to. I think the basic idea is that in a society as extraordinarily wealthy as this one is, the kinds of poverty that we see, especially if it's poverty that is avoidable and is not due to people's own bad choices, which some of it is ought to be unacceptable. And I think that's a very widespread view. And I was saying last night how extraordinarily philanthropic the United States is compared with other countries, partly because the countries, most of the income distribution and assistance to the poor is done by the government, as it is in this country as well, but also because of our religious traditions, which have made us more philanthropic than other societies. I think that bespeaks a belief that we should share some of our wealth with those who are unable to climb out of destitution through no fault of their own. Now, where to draw that line, what no fault of their own means, and all those are extraordinarily complicated questions that worth a few more seminars. But I see nothing wrong with moving the goalposts in that sense.
If you want to frown on people who make bad choices, you're an incipient Republican. All right. Rita.
What are some of the elements of, or the conditions for the policy successes that you named at the beginning?
Okay.
And have they changed from the 19th century?
An important question. The policy successes, what causes the policy successes? I discussed that at the end of that chapter. And here are some of the lessons. They're of a generalized nature, but I think they're not trivial. One is that the more programs try to change human nature and human character, the less likely they are to succeed. We don't know how to do that. Even our great religions don't really know how to do that. And so that's doomed to failure. Secondly, the programs that succeed tend to be programs that do what government can do well, which is to write checks. So the earned income tax credit, again, Social Security, retirement, not disability, but retirement, are examples of that. Some programs' successes have been relatively easy wins for a variety of reasons. I gave a talk earlier this morning. I'm not sure if I said that there or here, but the Homestead Act and the Morrill Act, two Lincoln-era policy creations, were successful because basically what the federal government was doing was handing out a lot of free land, which was not occupied except by the Native Americans. If any of you happen to see my interview on Jon Stewart in May, I made this point. He asked me about the Homestead Act. I made this point, except for the Native Americans who happened to be there and were destroyed to a great extent by this process. And he said, you could rewrite much of American history by adding, except for the Native Americans. So those are relevant, and the Morrill Act gave federal land to states in order to establish land grant college systems. A great success. Of course, second Morrill Act, which you folks probably don't know about, but I happen to study this and write about it. The second Morrill Act was adopted in 1890 by the same, at the instance of the same Senator Justin Morrill from Vermont, I think, and that established a dual system of land grant colleges. It was separate but equal in land grant colleges, not just the colleges, but the agricultural extension services that were attached to the colleges. There's a situation where government not only ratified but reinforced racial inequality through its programs, and it wasn't until the late 1960s, through litigation, that dual system was eliminated, at least formally. Now, I'm getting a bit far afield, but it's a very interesting and important point. We eliminated the dual system, the dual system, segregated system in the late 1960s as a result of civil rights litigation. But what that meant was terrible, devastating losses to the black communities that lost their institutions, because in most cases the black institution and the white institution were unified, and it was the white flagship campus that remained. A lot of black professionals and academics lost their jobs because they were unable to compete given their different credentials that occurred, and so on and so forth. It's a very, very sad story that is concealed behind the great civil rights victory that we won. But in any event, that explains some of the success. The success of the GI Bill was due, I think, to the fact that A, the government was in the business of writing checks, and B, the beneficiary population was a favored one, an almost universal one after World War II. Now that was another program that was infected by racism, and that's part of the story which I tell here. Another success is NIH, which is government spending for public goods, and there's a pretty clear market failure that requires the government to support basic research, and that's so. The Voting Rights Act is a good example of the government. And I'm talking about the original Voting Rights Act, not what the Voting Rights Act has become, which I think has become a source of actual great injustice, not on the whole, but in that it has institutionalized racial gerrymandering, largely orchestrated by the courts and the Justice Department, and really distorted our system of representation by creating a certain number of safe seats for minority candidates, which has, I discuss this in the book, I won't get into more detail on that. But the Voting Rights Act, the government basically eliminated barriers to access to the vote and left it to the self-interest of putative voters to vote. Now, I'm not in any way minimizing the struggle that was necessary to reach that point, and government efforts had a lot to do with that, although they're mostly private struggles that led the government finally to act in the mid-1960s. So those are some of the reasons why I think successful programs have sometimes been instituted.
Yes.
Forgive this softball, but I thank you very much for your book, one of the great delights of my 2014 summer. And I wondered after reading, I assume, in your case, many reviews and talking to hopefully many groups like this, I wondered which of the ideas you're pushing in the book generated the most resistance.
Well, I guess the main response to the book that has bothered me most is that it has not seemed to excite much interest among the left, among progressives. Indeed, I know of no review by any progressive publication. It has received a lot of support by conservatives and middle of the road publications, but not much on the left. And so I don't know whether that's resistance to the book or just ignoring it. But it seems to me I wrote the book in part to reach that audience, and so that's been quite disappointing.
Yes.
A couple of things. One is with regard to this income inequality. This idea has been pushed hard by the Democrats recently. I call it sort of trying to sell the politics of envy. It doesn't seem to resonate with the public at all. The surveys that I've seen, the polling, indicates that people are not really concerned about fairness in that regard. And if you ask what are the issues that are important to you, that never resonates high at all. Which means that people don't begrudge others the wealth, and maybe it's because when the Powerball lottery gets to $280 million, everybody dreams of winning it and doesn't want it taken away. The second point is, I wonder...
Just one quick interjection on that.
Yeah.
This can change sometimes. So, for example, immigration has traditionally been pretty far down on the list of issues that the public cares about intensely, and now it's near the top.
Well, the Democrats are hoping that will be
Sure.
the case, in which case they can get
Sure.
political gain, but certainly this past election didn't work for them at all. The second part is, I wonder if there's an overarching principle here. Was it Jefferson who said that government governs best, that governs least?
Yes.
If that's the case, after you get past some basic level function of government, is it just going to be an inevitable increase in government and decrease in efficiency and in terms of any kind of positive benefit that government can have? In other words, you're going to see, you mentioned the 19 million, I think that's a reference to the 50 years of poverty, the war on poverty. There are 126 different poverty programs in the government. The interest in keeping those and adding to them is with the people in the bureaucracy. Government always has an impulse to expand, but it's hard to see how the larger government gets, the better it gets at any level.
Well, it's perfectly clear, and I'm not suggesting that that I have some solution to the problem of poverty, or even that the poverty has been well defined for purposes of figuring out what to do about it. And this goes way back to I know it goes back to Tocqueville, but I'm sure it goes back far before that. But it's perfectly clear that if we took all the money that we spent on anti-poverty programs and simply wrote a check to people who are now considered poor, we would abolish poverty overnight. Now, whether that would be a good idea, it's not. I think it would be a bad idea, and I think many of them would become poor again quickly. So I think that's but it goes. I think it goes back to the question that elicited the comment that there's concern about. There's much less concern about achieving equality than achieving some level of sufficiency for people who lack it. That's what I think the American people care about and are committed to it. It may not be very high on the list of issues that they identify when pollsters ask them, but I have no doubt that that's a very strong commitment of the American people. They may feel that we've already achieved that. I don't know. That is to say, we've already supplied that level of resources. It's a very interesting article, which I would recommend, by Nick Eberstadt, called "The Mismeasure of Poverty," which I discuss here, and it's very much worth reading. And what he shows alludes to some of the trends in poverty reduction that were discussed a few minutes ago. But he also shows that on a consumption basis, rather than a nominal income basis, poverty has essentially been abolished in the United States if we measure it by the standards that existed 25, 30 years ago. So that's an important, needless to say, methodological and definitional problem as to how we measure poverty. But if you compare the standard of living, not the nominal income, but the standard of living that poor people enjoy today, it's much higher than was the case a long time ago.
Well, on that note, Peter, we have to close. I want to say how much we appreciate and are grateful for your talk today.